Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today I am joined by Zach Gollwitzer, and I found Zach over on YouTube through a great video that he actually had on Free Code Camp, and he also has additional content on his own channel, which we'll definitely get to here as we go. And some of that content is related to using TypeScript and TypeScript versus JavaScript and different things related to that. So that's going to be our main topic of discussion today. But before we kind of get to that, Zach, I think it'd be helpful to just kind of, if you could give me a little bit of a background on yourself, kind of as it relates to web development and stuff like that, just to give a little bit more context to this discussion.
Yeah, so my background, kind of have to go backwards a little bit to understand how I got here. I'm actually out of school, was a finance major, so that does not, translate very well to writing code or anything. But how I got here was basically started out in college. I played golf in college, and I was kind of at a tipping point of, this is not going to be a long-term thing. I need to figure things out. And ultimately, I decided to start a golf blog, just on WordPress, the typical, if you don't know how to write code, just go to WordPress and get started. So I built out that golf blog, and I found myself really enjoying the process of building that. And furthermore, I was very frustrated that I couldn't do much in terms of editing and customizing and making that blog how I envisioned it in my head. Not to say I'm a great designer or anything, but had some ideas that I just couldn't get out there into the world. And so that kind of started my journey of trying to learn how to code. And so you mentioned Free Code Camp. I spent some time, researching places that I could learn how to code back then. And Free Code Camp was one of those resources for me. I also stumbled upon CS50, which is Harvard's computer science 101 course. And I think that was really where I started. And I think my senior year of college, I really committed to doubling down and learning, not just how to code, but the deep fundamentals of computer science and how everything worked. So I spent probably half a year in CS50, and that was really hard for me. There was a lot of stuff that I just didn't get, but ultimately gave me a very solid foundation. Picked up a book called NAND to Tetris, which allowed you to build a computer from scratch. And that was kind of really how I learned the really deep internals of computer science, of the ones and the zeros and how that transistors relate to all that stuff. And then ultimately it was just a long journey of many years of practicing what I had started there and just building projects, and did some work outside of software for a while. But ultimately landed a couple jobs in the space and have been doing it ever since. So, it's been an awesome journey, and I'm very, very happy that I went down it in the first place.
Your story is actually very similar to mine, in which my background is actually exercise science, and actually went all the way to getting a master's in exercise science. And with that, while I was in school, I created my own website for kind of my online fitness coaching stuff. And in doing that, I used Wix instead of WordPress, but kind of similar platform. And I also ran into wanting to do things in Wix that I just couldn't do because I didn't know how to actually write code and stuff. So I started kind of playing around with that sort of thing, and actually took a job or my graduate assistantship for my master's degree actually involved working with their website and doing stuff like that. So that kind of started it with me. And then I also used Free Code Camp and different resources like that, as well as CS50. I think that is, I forget, David Milan maybe is the teacher of that. Yeah. And he, I think he's awesome. He does such a good job. You could definitely see why he's a teacher where he is. So very, very similar path to you. And that kind of sparked, wow, this is actually really, really cool stuff. So that's awesome.
Yeah, should really just put Harvard graduate on our resumes is kind of
I
what I
don't
was.
see why not. Yeah.
Yeah, got one course down.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. Well, I think that gives us a good background on yourself and stuff like that. So, to kind of transition a little bit into the topic of discussion today, which is kind of TypeScript versus JavaScript. So, I think a kind of good first place for us to start is first off, what is TypeScript? And then also, kind of second to that, why might someone actually want to use TypeScript instead of just like vanilla JavaScript?
Yeah, so I've been using TypeScript for pretty much the whole time I've been seriously developing web applications, and this was mainly because I started in the dreaded Angular framework back when it was, I think, on really just version 2. So I avoided that pre-version 2 madness that kind of is deprecated now. But the one thing people don't recognize a whole lot about Angular is they were kind of the trailblazers of using TypeScript. Their whole, framework was built with that in mind, and out of the box, you'd be using TypeScript. And so TypeScript is basically just a superset of JavaScript. And I think you'd call it a strongly typed language because unlike JavaScript, you have to define the types of your variables and functions and whatnot. And that's all checked at compile time versus runtime. So, in other words, you're going to find out your mistakes before they happen rather than debugging something in production and figuring it out at runtime or after the fact. It's not, one magic swoop that'll, make all of your programs run smoothly, but it definitely helps you catch a lot of those errors up front. But yeah, what I like to, describe it as is, all JavaScript is valid TypeScript, but not all TypeScript would be valid JavaScript, if I got that right. Sometimes I mix that one up a little bit, but yeah, that's kind of the overview of how I view TypeScript.
Awesome. It kind of side tangent. It reminds me of a quote my uncle always says is that all scotch is whiskey, but not all whiskey
Yeah,
is scotch. So
there
yeah.
you go. That's a good
You
one.
know, perfect. Cool. Well, I think that gives a good kind of overview of what TypeScript is, but like why would someone want to use TypeScript? You kind of mentioned that TypeScript does your type checking at like as you write it at compile time there. Is that kind of lead into one of the benefits of TypeScript?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably at the top of my list. I generally have three reasons that I love TypeScript and write it for most of my projects. Number one is going to be the autocomplete and IntelliSense, basically the type checking that you're referring to. Number two, it makes me a more proactive developer, just meaning it challenges me to think about the schemas and the function signatures and all of the data types that are flowing through my application. And that's just great because rather than, after the fact, you're really sitting down and understanding how everything's talking to each other and, what can I pass to this function? What does that accept? What does that spit out? So it really makes you kind of think about things. It makes you think more clearly, in my opinion. And then finally, the third one for me is maintainability. And this one cannot be overlooked because, especially if you're dealing with a large project or code base, and also with many developers, TypeScript is a great communication tool because it basically gives you some confidence and some boundaries to know, let's say that you write a project 3 months ago and it's got a pretty big code base. And now you're coming back to it 3 months later and you're like, oh, I don't remember, can't even find app.ts or anything, trying to get back into the code base. Having it, 100% TypeScript, which is maybe an optimistic goal for some, but if you do have it at 100% TypeScript, you can come back to that code base and go to a function that has maybe broken in production and make a fix to it. And you're going to have a lot more confidence knowing that that fix that you just made is not going to cause a ripple effect throughout the rest of your code base, or cause more bugs in other places. So, in my opinion, TypeScript does kind of allow you to write less tests. That might be unpopular, but just having that confidence with the types definitely makes it so you don't have to worry so much about testing every last bit of your code to have that confidence.
Yep, absolutely. I think that I would definitely agree with all those benefits. I would say for me, the biggest one is kind of the last one that you said of making your code base a little bit more maintainable, and then also like making things a little bit more self-documenting to where when you're collaborating with other people and stuff like that, it makes things a lot easier. As like in React, if you have your types specified for the props that you're using for that component, it makes it much easier on how you should use that component and stuff. So I think that those are definitely a few benefits there. And when kind of thinking about using TypeScript, do you have any kind of tips for people that are like considering using it? I know in your video you kind of mentioned maybe opting to be a bit more explicit or kind of using different utility types and avoiding the any type. Could you maybe hit on a few of just kind of like general tips for using TypeScript?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't consider myself a TypeScript wizard of any sort. There's definitely folks out there on the internet that kind of specialize in this, but I will give some of my own observations, things that I feel like I did wrong years ago, and now I would probably tell my past self to change. Um, the first thing is to use type inference when it's available to you. And what I mean by that is when I was first starting out, you have the ability to define the type of a variable in many different ways. You can cast it with the as keyword. You can use the little colon after the variable name to explicitly set the type. There's many ways to set that type. And something I found myself doing early on was just littering the whole code base with, types everywhere and, assigning a specific type to every single variable. And in reality, TypeScript is a lot smarter than that. And if let's say that you have a function that returns a simple object with a couple properties. Well, if you consume that function somewhere else in your code base, and set it equal to some variable, that variable is going to infer, or not the variable, but the return type of that function is going to be inferred and then subsequently assigned to that variable. So when you're working in Visual Studio Code, you should be able to basically hover over all your variables, and you'll see that inference happening in real time. And so that's just going back to the maintainability aspect. That's the one that will really help with maintainability, is just making sure that you're not, overusing TypeScript and letting it do what it's good at in the first place. And then I think the other big one that I would love to communicate, because it's a strong opinion that I have, is that types should be simple. I see a lot of TypeScript wizardry out there on the internet where you can use all sorts of utility types to, extract off properties and transform your types and pick properties. It's all great, and there are use cases for that, especially if you are like a library developer and you need more of those complex features. But in general, I would always opt for a type that is very readable, very simple. If you have to spend more than a second trying to understand what the type does, you better have a very clear reason why you've added that extra complexity, because there is nothing worse than going back to a code base. And I speak from my own personal experience of trying this and failing. You come back to a code base with really complex types, and it's just, why did you use TypeScript in the first place is kind of what you start thinking. So,
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, just because you can do something in TypeScript doesn't mean that you should. And I definitely, not even in just TypeScript, but in like other areas to where it's like you learn this new thing that you can do, like using the, I don't know, key of operator in TypeScript, or kind of defining or deriving types from other types and doing different things like that, in which, yeah, there are use cases in which that can be helpful and it might be kind of the right route to go. But often in the past, I would do it just because it was like this kind of clever thing that I could do rather than something that is kind of more maintainable and extendable in the long run. And 9 times out of 10, I probably just could have used an interface or just a regular type alias or something, instead of getting fancy with it. And usually keeping things simple and straightforward is probably a better call.
Yep. And I think that also applies to just programming in general. You know, when you're clever, when you learn something new, it is very tempting to be clever with it and showcase all of those skills that you've just learned. And, hey, I've got a hammer, where's the nail? Um, but it's always going to be better to keep things simple and readable for the future.
And kind of going back to your first point a little bit on uh, being kind of using type inference, I totally agree that like using it where you can is definitely important. Are there places to where you kind of decide to be a bit more explicit even when you could technically use inference? For example, I know that like for certain individuals, they will tend to be a bit more explicit around like functions or even around different components in React. Or do you kind of use inference like wherever you can, or are there those times to where you do want to be kind of a bit more explicit with defining those types?
Yeah, I do think there are use cases for that. And I know, I don't know if you saw it or anything, but there's a big Twitter feud about all of this, whether you should use inference or explicit,
I kind of stay off Twitter,
declarations.
so
Yeah, well, I think it was had some circles going around. But I would say that there's not, a one size fits all answer to that question. There's definitely times where inference makes sense and where explicit types make more sense. And I would say the one that sticks out the most to me for explicitly typing would be on some sort of utility functions. Or if you just have like functions sitting in an external file that are consumed by multiple parts of your application, and they're almost like, an internal library that you've developed for yourself. Those are always great to explicitly, have return types on as functions. And the reason being is because if you go to change those later, you know that they're being consumed in, maybe hundreds of different places within your code base. And so it just gives you a lot of confidence if you have an explicit return type on those utility functions. You know that that is the contract that you've set up with the rest of your code base. And when you go to change that, you can have the confidence to say, hey, I've changed the implementation detail of this utility function, but I know that the return type is exactly what I defined 3 weeks ago and consumed by my entire code base. So that would be one that I would always throw a return type on because it just gives you that extra confidence.
perfect. Yeah, I think that's a really good example of where you would want to potentially be more explicit. And like you said, there's no like one size fits all answer, no black and white answer for most of programming in general, but it's going to come down to like a case by case basis to where maybe sometimes where you could use inference, it'd be better to be more explicit. And you're just going to have to kind of decide that based on your own code base, your team, and stuff like that. So I think that provides like a few good general tips. Are there any kind of mistakes that you see people make when they go to use TypeScript? I know we kind of touched on a couple already here of, maybe being too explicit and not using inference where you can, or being a little bit too fancy with things. Is there anything else that kind of sticks out to you with maybe mistakes that you see or mistakes that you made when you're kind of first using it?
Yeah, I think just as a general rule, you can really get into this mode of trying to be perfect with TypeScript. And I think, over the years, we as developers have kind of learned that the 100% test coverage ideal is less of a practical thing. It's not something that actually happens in the real world, and it's not something you should necessarily strive for. And I would say that there's a parallel with that and your TypeScript types, where, yes, you can attempt to make your entire code base 100% TypeScript and have a type for literally anything or everything, and get rid of all the any's. Don't ignore any of the errors, and that is a good goal to set, I think, and that's what you should be striving for. But there are some cases, especially if the blast radius is very small, where I'll just throw an any, in there just to keep moving and keep the project going. And I know, that kind of comes down to, well, hey, are you working alone or are you working on a team? I think you have less liberty in this area if you're working on a big team that has code quality standards. But I do a lot of projects on my own, as many watching this probably do. And I think that's a really good case for, like, don't try to be too perfect. Like, this is a tool for you to help you write better code and maintain it better. And you can still get, 99% of the benefits without going completely overboard and, getting the whole code base absolutely perfect.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Like you could have 95% of your app strongly typed and getting a lot of benefits from that. And, technically speaking, you probably could get that 5%, but the amount of time that you're going to spend on that 5% is probably going to be disproportionately greater compared to what it took you to get to that 95%. So I think that, just like that analogy with testing, yes, technically speaking, it'd be great to have 100% code coverage across your entire app, but maybe you could put in 20% of the effort and get 80% covered and receive most of the benefits of testing, to where sometimes you just have to, make that kind of cost benefit analysis of, is that extra little bit really worth the time and effort that goes into it? So I think that's a good example there. And it provides like good kind of context around when people hear like, you should never use the type any, or you should, never do this or that in TypeScript. Technically speaking, that's a good thing to shoot for, but practically speaking, sometimes it doesn't always work out like that. So I really like that one. Are there any situations in which you would actually opt to use JavaScript instead of TypeScript? Or do you tend to just kind of stick to TypeScript in most applications that you use? Or how do you kind of view that there?
By default, I reach for TypeScript. That's generally going to be what I set up when I start a new project, mainly because I'm comfortable with it, but also all the benefits that we talked about. Now, there are a few times where I will, explicitly opt out of TypeScript. And one of those is whenever I'm writing just like utility scripts. The other day, I was writing a data migration script that was just taking a bunch of records and pushing them up to MongoDB. And for something like that, it was in the context of a TypeScript code base, but I just had a scripts folder and just threw a bunch of JS files in there. Because, if you're not going to come back to this, if it's just a one-time thing, TypeScript absolutely gets in the way. And because there's overhead to it, you have to transpile it before it'll run. You have to set up all the configuration. You can't just run a node script. You have to run TS node. So that's one use case there. And then the second time where I won't choose TypeScript is, let's say that you have, like, this happened to me recently. I had a template that I, downloaded and purchased from a company that, made React templates. And they had written everything in just vanilla JavaScript, JSX. And so you bring that in, and the beauty of TypeScript is you can mix the two. You can have TypeScript and JavaScript in the same code base. And so I pulled that in, and you kind of have to look at it of like, well, hey, I can spend the next day converting all of these templates from JavaScript or JSX to TSX, Or I can just drop them in, know that they've been written well by the original developer, and just do the rest of the code base in TypeScript. And then, maybe there's a few things that I want to convert that I often interface with, but those are kind of the times that I would not try to go 100% TypeScript.
I can totally see both those use cases. And then, maybe one to add would be like, if you're working with a few other people that maybe don't have any experience with TypeScript, and the kind of time cost to getting them up to speed to working with TypeScript is just like more than what's needed for your application at that point, and then maybe you opt to kind of go with kind of JavaScript there. But I think both of those or all those are good use cases for that. And kind of what you just mentioned there regarding not needing to convert your application all the way to TypeScript, I think that leads us perfectly into kind of making that migration process. So if someone already has a JavaScript application, are they able to just go, it sounds like they are, just like file by file and slowly kind of convert their app to TypeScript? Or how do you kind of recommend someone go through that migration process of, if they have a JavaScript app, converting it to a TypeScript app?
Yeah, so when you're dealing with TypeScript, there's kind of this master file called the tsconfig. And that tsconfig has hundreds of different settings and options, all documented pretty well in their reference. But you can be as strict or as flexible as you want with that configuration file. And so if you have a JavaScript code base that, 100% vanilla JavaScript, and you're trying to get the benefits of TypeScript, it's not going to be feasible, especially if it's huge. You have a large team. Both of those factors are contributing. It's not going to be feasible to just say, okay, I'm going to make one pull request to convert the whole code base. You're going to have to do it incrementally. And the TypeScript configuration file allows you to do that. So what you're going to want to start with is there's a property called allow.js, and this allows you to have the mix of the two files. And then the second one is the strictness of everything. So there's a couple popular tsconfig options that when I'm starting a project from scratch and I know it's going to be 100% TypeScript, I'm always going to throw on strict mode, and I'm always going to add the no implicit any type. And those will catch a lot of the anti-patterns that you might come across when you're dealing in TypeScript. But if you're converting your code base, you cannot flip those on right away. Otherwise, you're going to look in your Visual Studio code editor and see red squiggly lines in every file, and it's not going to compile. There's also a configuration option for compilation, like if you can set it to still compile even if there are TypeScript errors, and that goes back to the JavaScript, and TypeScript is just that superset of JavaScript, so it'll still work. But yeah, I think when you're migrating, you just want to do it incrementally, and the end goal is to get to that strict mode in the tsconfig options. But along the way, you're going to have to kind of be more lenient with things and just go file by file until you have more of coverage.
Perfect. I think that's a super important point, is that it doesn't have to be like all at once. You don't need to commit like 3 straight weeks of doing just focusing on converting to TypeScript. You can, like you said, add that tsconfig and kind of toggle on some different properties that can increase or decrease the strictness of your types to kind of allow you to gradually do that process incrementally over time. So I think with that, Zach, it's coming up on time here. If people are like, hey, this guy really knows his stuff, I want to look further into the content that he's producing, where should people go to kind of find you?
Yeah, so I got a couple channels that you can reach me at. The first one I'll mention is my YouTube channel. I talk about TypeScript and other programming content there. Also have a website that just kind of home base for everything. And then I'm on Twitter at ZG_dev, DEV. I'm pretty active there, so you can reach me there as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Zach.
Yeah, appreciate you having me. Thank you.